Welcome everyone, this is Tactical Lich here, and today, submitted by Cool Umbrella, we have a land battle between two very grindy factions. On the right hand side, we have the Nurgle, led by Cool Umbrella himself, with a front line of Nurglings backed up by some Plague Bearers, as well as some Forsakens on the flanks. Basically going for an almost 20 full stack army with a lot of infantry, led by a couple cultists with their Plague Bearer summons, as well as a Herald of Khorne, trying to use that numbers advantage as well as the healing prowess and the defense mechanic. The defense buff of every single one of the demons, the Cloud of Flies, plus 9 melee defense, providing a lot of staying power for the whole Nurgle army, allowing them to take a lot of punishing in melee and outgrind their opponents, which are the Cathay, who are now buffed up by the Harmony effect due to the presence of some missile units. In the front line, we have the Peasant Long Spears as well as the Jade Warriors. A rather chaffy front line with a couple sturdier backbone, and at the back we have 3 Jade Warriors with halberds protecting the rear and the flanks. In the skies we have a Shugengan Lord with a Yin Lord of Magic, providing a bunch of spells actually, the Talents of the Night for sure, and the Blossom Wind. Not exactly the greatest spell, but it does provide the blinded effect to lower the melee stats of their opponent, and Ancestral Warriors providing extra elite warriors that can hold line, providing that anti-large armor-piercing damage. Basically, a few very powerful abilities supporting the fight, but no healing. Soaring in the skies alongside that Shugengan Lord, we have the Great Longma Riders, providing that mobility force to pin down Furies, counteract enemy mobility, and protect the archers and the Iron Hail Gunners. In the middle, we have the powerhouse of the Cathay army, 2 really tanky and also good at grinding entities, Terracotta Sentinels. A lot of armor, a lot of HP. They will be holding the line, trying to grind through all this chaff of the Nurgle army. And that's basically it for the army builds. Let's get the battle started. Despite the lack of artillery on both ends, the Nurgle army will be approaching the Cathay army, as the Cathay army do have the missile advantage in terms of the crossbowmen and Iron Hail Gunners, while the Nurgle army does rely on getting into melee to activate the Cloud of Flies effect to get some extra melee defense to help them hold the line. Plus, they cannot hold back since they do not have soul grinders to bombard enemy formations anyways. And as the Nurglings approach, the Celestial Dragon crossbows, who does have longer range than the Iron Hail Gunners, are opening up fire, trying to get some damage done with their ammo before the melee fight begins. While the front line, the Jade Warriors and Peasant Spears are just charging forward, clashing into the Nurglings, who are taking quite some damage from the charge, but are dishing out quite a bit of damage in return actually. Despite being armored, the Jade Warriors are still taking casualties after being charged by the Nurglings. The poison no doubt is lowering their melee attack damage and allowing the Nurglings to hold a little longer, as the Forsakens are now pushing around the flanks, going to envelope this box of the Cathay army, as these Peasant Long Spears sacrificing their lives to act as a mere speed bump will do pretty much nothing to these Forsaken, but other than slowing them down. In the middle, the grind is truly underway as the Plague Bearers of Nurgle are pushing into the front line, beating down some of these Jade Warriors, but also the Terracotta Sentinels are charging in, supporting this fight alongside with some summoned Ancestral Warriors, recharging all these Nurglings and Plague Bearers, really focusing down this middle section of the Nurgle front line. In response, a cultist of Nurgle summoned some Plague Bearers at the back, tying down all these Iron Hail Gunners, preventing them from fire alongside with some Furies. While Celestial Dragon crossbows might be good at combat, Iron Hail Gunners are not, and they will be soon routed. The Chaos Furies, deployed on each corner of the map that I totally forgot to cover, are now in the front line, bogging down all these missile units. The Celestial Dragon crossbows are being tied down. Thankfully, they're decent in melee with heavy armor, so they will be holding in this combat, buying time for the Great Longma Riders to charge in, reinforce this fight, and fend off the Furies. In contrast, the Iron Hail Gunners are not so lucky, as the Forsaken have broken through the flanks, charging straight for the backlines, and these missile troops will be routed by a combination of Furies, Plague Bearers, Summons, and the Forsaken. The Cathay frontline is barely holding, with the Terracotta Sentinels smashing apart some of these Nurglings and Plague Bearers, while the Jade Warriors with halberds are desperately trying to hold on. doing some decent damage with the support of the Ancestral Warriors, but unfortunately they are only summoned units and they basically disappear right here and there. And with the huge presence of the Cathay army gone, the Jade Warriors can no longer hold up their leadership. The Cathay frontline is now buckling, as they are now surrounded by the Plague Bearers and the flanking Forsaken army, being overwhelmed by a sea of sickly bodies of the Nurgle army. And that leaves the Terracotta Sentinel alone, fighting, isolated. They are being slowly whittled away by a bunch of enemy infantry, although there is now a second summon of Ancestral Warriors providing a relief force for these single entities. Still, I would argue that a Talons of the Night would be a bit better for this unholy blob of Nurgle infantry, trapping and devouring all these enemy units. But with the warriors summoned, I doubt the Cathay player has enough magic to drop in another Talons of the Night. At the back, we have the Great Loma Riders being pinned down by all these Nurglings being slowly dragged down. However, the Celestial Dragon crossbows are being freed up and are finally able to start firing again, shooting into the blobs, doing some decent damage with their armor-piercing, high missile strength crossbow buffed up by that harmony effect. They should be able to do some damage throughout the whole combat as long as they can fire, especially with long spears and Loma Riders as well as the Shogun Lords sacrificing themselves on the line trying to save these crossbows. Now, the front line would be a huge problem here as the Ancestral Warriors are being beat down by the magic attacks from both the Plague Bearers as well as the Nurglings. The physical resistance on these infantry really counts for nothing against the magic attacks of the Nurgle army, although they are helping the Terracotta Sentinels to absorb a bit more damage, helping them hold a little longer. But at this point, the Ancestral Warriors have routed. Even the elite armies of Aeons Past, who came back from the dead trying to aid the Cathay army once more, is no match for this unholy blob of Nurgle infantry. You can see that they are just slowly swarming forward, trying to envelope all these Terracotta Sentinels. But at this point, since the Dragon Crossbowmen are now free to fire again, the Nurgle player decided that it is time to keep pushing, shut down their missile units, although the Great Loma Riders as well as the Shogun Lord are still trying to tie down all these infantry as well as some of these remaining Jade Warriors. And now the Terracotta Sentinels, despite being very powerful melee combatants, they are only a single entity model and they cannot tie down all these infantry units, and the Nurgle army finally converging into a single terrifying blob of infantry units. Nothing on the battlefield can stop them from flooding forward, charging down whatever small pocket of resistance that Cathay has. However, the Celestial Dragon crossbows have successfully retreated away from this whole blob, and knowing that the slow Nurgle army cannot catch up with these guys, the Nurgle player Cool Umbrella decided to just go back and keep grinding on these Terracotta Sentinels, and with the character support, they're actually doing some okay damage to the Terracotta Sentinels. And Terracotta Sentinels, they're not exactly the greatest infantry killer with their questionable splash attack damage. For some reason, they just don't really kill all that many infantry. Despite fighting through all these blobs for the whole time, they only have less than 50 kills on this one, slightly more than 50 kills on the other. And now finally, a juicy Talons of the Night, hitting a huge bunch of blobbed up infantry, devouring some of that Nurgling forces, as well as the Plague Bearers and Forsaken. But this might not be enough. I doubt that is an overcast, as it is not doing as much damage as you usually see. Not quite enough to turn the tide of combat. Now, the balance of power is still even on both ends, but the Terracotta Sentinels are just having trouble killing off all these infantry, while the Dragon Crossbows, they are firing in for sure, but they only have so much ammo and will not be able to turn the table. So now for a bit of spoiler alert, this will be a long grind, so we will be going into fast forward, and if we have a look at the timer, we are almost at the 8-minute mark. Terracotta Sentinels slowly grinding through all these infantry, but the Nurgle infantry are just so tanky, especially with another Talons of the Night unfortunately being dodged by most of the forces of the remaining Nurgle army. The Cathay player seems to be running out of steam. Now, the balance of power was temporarily in favor of the Cathay army, but a summon of a fresh Plague Bearers of Nurgle, they are now filling up the battlefield, providing a little bit more support and also hit point sponges to absorb the hit from all these Terracotta Sentinels. allowing all these single entities of the Nurgle army to surround these Terracotta Sentinels a bit better and start beating them down with that numbers advantage in terms of single entities. And every time the Shogun Lord tries to charge in to cycle charge and snipe out the single characters, her movement is seriously hampered in this blob. He or she will be bogged down by all these plague bearers, all these Nurglings infantry and whatnot, and being pinned down by multiple single entities, she is receiving massive damage throughout this melee combat. Even if she managed to extract herself, really, this is not a cost-effective trade as she is not down to half health and there's no more healing for the Cathay army. So let's keep going back to fast forward again, as this will be a long grind, as the Terracotta Sentinels finally up to 100 kills, 116 on the other one, finally punching their way through all these infantry. But at this point, one of the Terracotta Sentinels is extremely low, almost being finished, and the Shogun Lord is yet again trying to charge in, but bogged down by all these Forsaken plague bearers, slowly pushing her way out, but now down to around 40% of her HP. Things are looking quite bleak for the Cathay army as the balance of power is slowly inching forward for the Nurgle army. As the three single entities of the Nurgle army are still rather healthy, the Herald of Nurgle almost at his healing cap, but still rather still having around 40% of HP left, and the two very healthy cultists, they're not primarily armor piercing in terms of weapon strength, but they still have enough to put a dent in the Terracotta Sentinel as long as there are any plague bears to absorb those hits, distracting the attention of the single entities on the Cathay side. So let's just keep going back into fast forward as we're hitting the 12-minute mark. It's been 5 minutes since the first fast forward and there is still a plague bearer standing on the battlefield, really showing the tenacity of Nurgle. And now the first single entity, this Terracotta Sentinel, is fallen to the grind between the plague bearers who are still holding. The leadership is still up. They are almost wavering, but it is still positive, while the cultists of Nurgle, despite taking some damage, has successfully beat down one of the giant Terracotta Sentinel. And the Shogun Lord tries to rush in for a charge again, but it seems that the flying charge bug is now in effect, as the Shogun Lord just simply cannot land, being bogged down, pinned down by the plague bearers, and now decided to give up, pull back, and drop in once again. And this time it seems that she managed to land a hit, but unfortunately the Nurgle Herald is pushing in and put another hit into the dragon-blooded Shogun Lord, especially being poisoned. She will be slowed down and her hits will be less effective. Same goes for the Terracotta Sentinel. That's also partly why their damage output is so low, as their weapon strength is being constantly debuffed. And now with the Sundered Armor from one of the abilities of the three Nurgle single entities, the Terracotta Sentinel is taking massive damage throughout the whole combat despite the lack of armor piercing on the entire Nurgle roster, as the Sentinel is down to 70 armor, mitigating less damage from every hit. And the Terracotta Sentinel, right now being surrounded by the single entities, will be slowly surrounded, being beat down. The Shogun Lord tries to drop in to hit them in again, but it seems that without Earthblood, opting for the more damaging Lore of Yin, Dragon-blooded Shogun Lord was unable to outgrind all these Nurgle army due to the lack of heals, and surrounded by a bunch of single entities, both the Shogun Lord and the Terracotta Sentinel is getting slowly whittled down despite the lack of high weapon strength entities. And with the Shogun Lord being routed, there's no chance for the Terracotta Sentinel to pull back against 3 single entities. So let's just go back into fast forward as we're hitting the 16-minute mark. 8 minutes has gone by in the battle since the very first fast forward. In the ultimate grind fest lasting over 16 minutes, Nurgle finally finished off all those Terracotta Sentinels and the entire Cathay army. Honestly, when I finished watching this replay for the first time, I was a bit speechless. On one hand, I was astonished by the resilience on both armies. We have the Sentinels with their meaty HP pool as well as the high armor. They were able to tank out the damage from the unholy blob of Nurgle infantry. And the Nurgle army, of course, their tankiness is their staple, able to heal up, absorbing all those damage with their huge HP pool. Just two really grindy combo of army units. However, on the other hand, I was also disappointed, almost feeling the whole damage output of both armies are quite pathetic. I mean, of course, it is Nurgle, so that is much to be expected. But the Terracotta Sentinels, even after 15 minutes of grinding, they were unable to finish the entire Nurgle army despite only the single characters are left. Due to the high melee defense the Cloud of Flies provide them, as well as the poison debuff lowering the weapon damage on these Terracotta Sentinels and other Cathay units, the Cathay army was not able to do too much damage, especially when the Cathay player opted for the Ancestral Warrior summons instead of more Talons of the Night. That was truly a big mistake. Unable to clean up all this infantry blob, the numbers of these bodies are just way too much for the Terracotta Sentinels, who have, well, questionable splash attack damage. If we take a look at their damage value after fighting through the whole game, almost 15 minutes of full combat, and we have only 2,000 value on both of these units, 2,200 on the other one, and less than 150 kills on both ends, despite facing off so many infantry. That's partly because of the healing from Nurgle, as well as the poison debuff and the melee defense buff of the Cloud of Flies on the Nurgle units really put them in a disadvantage in this kind of blob fight. However, of course, Nurgle doesn't have that many good large anti-armor units. We have the Forsaken doing really good job in cleaning up all those Cathay infantry, but basically that's about it. All the other units unable to find any good engagement. Only these Plague Bearers of Nurgle were able to earn back their value. Otherwise, all these Nurglings, the Furies, and the other Plague Bearers as well, unable to do too much damage, especially up against the Terracotta Sentinels. And due to the lack of missile troops, the Furies just basically got beaten down by all these infantry melee units, only able to rout off some of these Iron Hail Gunners. That leaves the burden of carrying the army onto the cultists of Nurgle, actually managing to earn back their own value here, getting some really good value on both of these guys, and the Herald of Nurgle getting over 2k damage value. They were able to use that survivability to their advantage, slowly but steadily chipping away the health of these Terracotta Sentinels, while the Sentinels are distracted by all these infantry units, unable to focus down any of these single entities of the Nurgle army as they are hiding among their troops, backstabbing all these big constructs who are isolated as their infantry support of the Cathay army are routed. And the dragon-blooded Shogun Lord doesn't have the melee prowess of Miao Ying, unable to snipe out the single entities of the Nurgle army by psycho-charging alone, as she is constantly bogged down by all those Plague Bearers and infantry support, being backstabbed instead by the counterpunch of the cultists and the Herald of Nurgle. However, the Talons of the Night did do some quite significant damage, clearing out huge blobs of Nurgle infantry, but unfortunately just not enough to turn around the game, as some of that magic were wasted on other spells like the Blossom Wind, as well as the Ancestral Warrior summons. As for the other units, we have the Longma Riders, not actually earning that much value. The Psycho Charges were great, but without healing, they were not able to sustain too long in fights and being dragged down by Forsaken and also Plague Bearers. While the Celestial Dragon crossbowmen were able to use up all their ammo, shooting down all the infantry of the Nurgle army, but unfortunately, the healing probably was a bit too much, or the HP pool on the Nurgle units are a bit too much for these Celestial Dragon crossbowmen to carry the game, doing a lot of damage but not enough to turn the tables. As for the rest of the Cathay army, all of them basically got dragged down in combat by surround and flanking. Basically, the Nurgle army pinned them down with a bunch of Plague Bearers and the Nurglings, and flank around with the devastating charge of the Forsaken mopping up all the infantry line on the Cathay side. A very effective hammer and anvil tactic, just that the Nurgle this time do it with infantry. Forsaken, the only offensive infantry on the Nurgle roster, does have enough speed to perform all these kind of flanking tactics. As for the Peasant Long Spears, they are peasants after all, so really not much to talk about them, and the Iron Hail Gunners got shut down pretty hard by the Plague Bearer summons as well as their Furies. And yeah, that's basically it for today's battle. Big thanks to Cool Umbrella for submitting this replay. This replay really showcased the tenacity of the Nurgle army, even able to outgrind double Terracotta Sentinels, bringing down the big armored constructs with non-armor piercing chip damage alone, proving that Nurgle is the father of all grinds. And viewers, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed this replay. If you want to see more Total War Warhammer multiplayer content, remember to hit the like and subscribe to get notified every time I upload a new video. They'll be covering battle replays like this one, wild army builds, tactics and strategies for Total War Warhammer multiplayer. And if you want to submit your own replay, feel free to drop by my Discord or send me an email with replay files attached. I'll be sure to check them out. Anyways, that's all for now. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Tactical Lich, signing out.